Before dawn on March 1st, 1910, the mountain above Wellington, Washington was hidden in darkness. Rain struck roofs and rail cars. Wind moved through the narrow valley near Stevens Pass. For nearly a week, two great northern railway trains had been trapped there by snow and repeated slides. Passengers, postal workers, train crews, and laborers had waited while the railroad fought to reopen the line. Some had already decided that remaining on the trains was too dangerous and had walked away through the storm. Those who stayed could not know that the long delay was almost over. In the early hours before dawn, the slope above the tracks released. Snow, ice, trees, and debris moved downhill with enough force to lift rail cars from the line and carry them into the valley below. By sunrise, the passenger train, the fast mail train, and several railroad structures were buried or destroyed. 96 people were dead. 23 survived. The Wellington Avalanche became the deadliest avalanche disaster recorded in United States history. But the tragedy was not simply a sudden encounter between a train and a mountain. It was the final moment in a chain of decisions: weather changes, blocked tracks, failed communication, and growing danger that had developed over several days. Wellington stood high in Washington's Cascade Mountains, near the west portal of the original Cascade Tunnel. It was not a large town. It existed mainly to serve the Great Northern Railway, whose route crossed Stevens Pass on its way between the interior Northwest and Puget Sound. Railroad employees lived and worked there. Engines were serviced there. Trains paused before or after passing through the tunnel. The location was essential to the railroad, but it was also exposed. The tracks ran beneath steep slopes where winter storms could load the mountains with unstable snow. The railway used crews, plows, tunnels, and wooden protective structures to keep traffic moving, but the system depended on workers being able to clear one obstruction before the next one arrived. The route itself had been built to solve an earlier problem. Before the first Cascade Tunnel opened in 1900, trains crossed the pass on a difficult switchback alignment. The tunnel reduced the climb, but it did not remove the exposed western approach. West of the portal, the track followed the mountainside on a grade above Tie Creek, passing through cuts, short protective sections, and places where falling snow could reach the rails. Wellington grew at this operational bottleneck because the railway needed people and equipment close to the tunnel. That geography shaped every choice during the storm. A train was not waiting on open prairie where another locomotive could easily approach from either direction. It was standing on a narrow shelf between a steep slope and a drop into the valley. To the east was a long tunnel and more snowbound track. To the west were repeated slides. Even a powerful rotary plow required fuel, a clear place to throw snow, and enough open railway to move. When slides trapped or separated the plows from Wellington, the railroad's strongest winter machines became almost useless. In late February 1910, that system began to fail. On February 23rd, two westbound trains continued from Leavenworth toward the Cascades. One was passenger train number 25, often identified as the Spokane Local or Seattle Express. The other was fast mail train number 27. Together, they carried passengers, postal clerks, railroad employees, and laborers. Snow had already disrupted travel. As the trains moved toward the summit, conditions worsened. Slides blocked the route, and rotary snowplows struggled to reopen it. A rotary plow used a large circular blade to cut through snow and throw it away from the track. Under ordinary conditions, it could clear deep drifts. During this storm, new slides repeatedly filled areas that crews had just opened. The trains eventually passed through the Cascade Tunnel and stopped near Wellington on the western side. They could not continue downhill because the track ahead was blocked. They could not simply return east because other slides and damaged sections stood behind them. For 6 days, the trains remained on the mountain. The wait transformed Wellington from a railroad stop into an isolated camp. Snow continued to fall. Railroad workers tried to clear the line while passengers moved between the trains and buildings in town. Food became more limited. Communication became uncertain. On February 26th, telegraph lines went down, cutting Wellington off from direct contact with the outside world. The passengers could see evidence of the danger around them. Slides had already occurred in the area. Snow accumulated above the parked cars. Some people asked whether the trains should be moved into the Cascade tunnel, where the mountain itself might provide protection from an avalanche. Railroad officials considered the tunnel dangerous for occupied trains because ventilation was poor and engines could fill it with smoke and gas. The safer choice was not obvious. Remaining outside left the trains exposed to the slope. Moving inside introduced a different threat. The uncertainty became part of the ordeal. Every hour without movement meant more snow above the tracks and fewer options below them. By February 28th, several passengers had decided to leave on foot. Small groups crossed the obstructed railway toward Scenic, the nearest point where communication and assistance might still be available. The journey was dangerous. They had to climb over or around enormous slide deposits in severe weather. Their decision removed them from Wellington before the final avalanche and almost certainly saved their lives. Those who remained prepared for another night. Then the weather changed. After days of heavy snow, warmer air brought rain. An electrical storm moved through the mountains with strong wind, lightning, and thunder reported in contemporary accounts. Rain added weight and water to the snowpack. The precise physical sequence that released the slope cannot now be reconstructed with complete certainty, but the conditions had become extremely unstable. Sometime in the early morning hours of March 1st, a mass of snow broke loose high above Wellington. The avalanche descended toward the railroad with trees and debris caught inside it. It struck the area where the trains had been parked. Passenger cars, mail cars, locomotives, and railroad equipment were pushed from the track. Some were carried roughly 150 feet into the Tai River Valley. Buildings and sleeping quarters near the line were also caught. The violence lasted only moments. The isolation that followed lasted much longer. People who had been in Wellington rushed toward the wreckage. With no functioning telegraph in town and the surrounding railway still obstructed, the first rescue effort depended on local survivors and railroad workers. They dug through snow and broken material, listening for anyone still alive. 23 people were rescued from the disaster. The scale of the loss was not immediately understood outside the mountains. Early newspaper reports carried changing estimates because communication was broken and the scene was difficult to reach. Some reports underestimated the number missing. Others published totals that later proved too high. The confusion reflected the conditions. Rescuers were working in unstable terrain. Transportation routes were blocked, and information moved slowly from Wellington to places where it could be telegraphed. Relief parties eventually reached the area. Doctors, nurses, railroad crews, and volunteers joined the work. The injured were moved away from the mountain when routes allowed. Recovery teams continued searching through snow and wreckage, but the danger of additional slides remained. Work could not proceed as if the mountain had become safe simply because the first avalanche had passed. The confirmed death toll was 96. The victims included passengers, railroad employees, postal workers, and laborers. Historical accounts identify 35 passengers, 58 railroad employees who had been aboard the trains, and 3 railroad employees in nearby cabins. These numbers reveal why the fast mail train and work crews were so important to the final toll. This was not only a passenger disaster. Wellington was also a workplace, and many of those lost had been trying to keep the railway operating through the storm. The recovery continued for months. Contemporary photographs preserved by regional archives show the damaged equipment, rescue workers, and the scale of the debris field. The final victim was not recovered until July, after seasonal melting exposed areas that winter snow had concealed. In the immediate aftermath, Americans encountered the event through newspaper headlines and photographs. The story seemed almost impossible. 2 full trains held motionless for days, surrounded by danger, then removed from the railway in a single early morning slide. Yet the surviving records make clear that the catastrophe did not arrive without warning. The warnings were present in the blocked tracks, repeated avalanches, failed telegraph lines, deepening snow, and passengers who chose to leave. What remained uncertain was what could realistically have been done. Moving the trains into the tunnel might have protected them from the avalanche, but the ventilation danger was real. Attempting to move them elsewhere could have exposed crews and passengers to blocked or unstable track. Evacuating everyone on foot would have required sending a large group through active avalanche terrain in severe weather. The disaster has therefore remained a story not only of natural force, but of decisions made when every available option carried risk. The railway responded by expanding protection along the route. Great Northern constructed extensive snowsheds between Scenic and Wellington, including a long concrete structure near the disaster site. These sheds were designed to allow avalanches to pass over the tracks rather than strike trains directly. The name Wellington also disappeared. Later in 1910, the railroad town was renamed Ty, reducing the association between the station and the tragedy. But engineering changes continued beyond the new name. In 1929, a longer Cascade tunnel opened on a different alignment, bypassing the old route and the town. Ty was abandoned, and the former railway grade gradually became a historic landscape. Today, parts of that route survive as the Iron Goat Trail. Visitors can see tunnel portals, concrete snowshed remains, foundations, and the narrow corridor where the Great Northern once crossed the Cascades. The surviving structures do not recreate the lost town, but they show how closely the railroad had been pressed between engineered ambition and mountain terrain. The Wellington Avalanche is sometimes reduced to a number: 96 dead, 23 survivors. The number establishes its place in history, but it does not explain why the story still carries such weight. It endures because the disaster unfolded slowly before it happened suddenly. For days, people watched the snow rise and the routes close. Workers fought the mountain with machines and shovels. Passengers debated whether to stay, enter the tunnel, or walk away. The telegraph failed. The weather warmed. Rain fell onto deep snow. Then, in darkness, the entire situation changed in moments. More than a century later, the old grade near Stevens Pass remains quiet. Trains now use a different tunnel. Wellington no longer appears as a living railroad town. But along the abandoned route, concrete walls still stand beneath the same slopes. They are reminders that the avalanche was not hidden by history. The landscape still holds its outline.